If Israel can demonstrate that everything bad that happens to Israel in the Middle East, every security threat to Israel's well-being, is orchestrated by Tehran, is planned by Tehran, is part of Tehran's mythical, fabled Ring of Fire, and that lets Israel off just about every hook in existence. We used to talk about how even though we understand Iran is pragmatic, we can't take the risk that some crazy messianic zealot will gain control of the red button. Uh, you can sort of say that about Israel now.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. In the shadow of escalating tensions and missile strikes, Israel's perception of Iran remains oversimplified, a faceless enemy entrenched in fanaticism. But what if this narrative misses the deeper complexities driving Iran's actions? And how does Hezbollah and the ongoing conflict in Gaza fit into this dangerous puzzle? Today we delve into the hard truths with Dr. Ori Goldberg from Tel Aviv, Israel. We explore the realities behind the rhetoric that shapes the Middle East's most volatile relationships right here on The Focus. Ori, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you for having me, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ori, you say that you've been silenced for your critical views after October 7, particularly regarding Gaza and Iran. To what extent do you believe Israeli media serves as a tool for government propaganda, and how has this restricted nuanced discourse on Iran and regional conflicts?
Well, I haven't been silenced in the sense of having been actively muzzled or threatened or warned or anything. I've just been erased. And that's okay, by the way. I'm not complaining. I think Israeli media doesn't have to actively serve government propaganda. I think Israeli media reflects deeply held convictions in both Israeli society at large and by professional circles in Israel that deal with national security and security perceptions and concepts. So, I mean, Israeli media's pundits are usually former generals or former Shin Bet senior leaders and so on. So I think this is simply the systemic view perpetuating itself and thereby expanding to fill any and all voids.
Netanyahu has always been hostile toward Iran. I remember in 2006 when I arrived in the Middle East to commence work as an analyst, the country that I was residing in was genuinely fearful of a major total war erupting between Israel and Iran back then. At the time, Netanyahu was leading the Likud party in opposition. To what degree are we seeing a sort of fulfillment of Netanyahu's long-term policy goal of forcefully diminishing the Ayatollah's power and influence in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and even Iran itself?
Oh, I'm pretty sure that wasn't Netanyahu's long-term policy, and I highly doubt Netanyahu has a long-term policy. Um, the appeal of what we in Israel call the Iranian threat is that it is actually quite useful for many short-term gains, and certainly not just for the long term, because if Israel can demonstrate that everything bad that happens to Israel in the Middle East, every security threat to Israel's well-being, is orchestrated by Tehran, is planned by Tehran, is part of Tehran's mythical, fabled Ring of Fire, and that lets Israel off just about every hook in existence. If Hamas is an Iranian proxy or an Iranian operative, that means that Hamas's attack on October 7th has nothing to do with the siege and blockade Israel has been laying on Gaza for nearly 20 years. And it means that the events in the West Bank and Israel's loss of control there is simply another demonstration of Iranian prowess in smuggling weapons and radicalizing innocent Palestinians. And it has nothing to do with Israel's nearly 60-year-old military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. That is the great appeal of Iran as a potential and perennial threat to Israel. I don't know that Netanyahu has a long-term policy here, except the perpetuation of the threat. Israel needs the Iranian threat, not just Netanyahu. It's true that Netanyahu has contributed the most, I think, of any Israeli leader to the blow up of the Iranian threat to its current size. This idea that everything that happens to Israel happens at the fault and the active planning of Iran, but there's a kind of a general sense that this threat, regardless of what Israel does, this threat will forever remain because the Iranians want to destroy us. We don't want to destroy them. They want to destroy us. And as long as destruction is on the table, it doesn't really matter what you do and how much of it you do. It's always going to be there until one side goes away. So Israel may appear strategic, but in truth, I think it's a kind of a self-perpetuating justification or attempt at justification for everything Israel does in the Middle East. I think that's the purpose the Iranian threat serves for Israel and for Netanyahu, who has been prime minister for nearly all the time you described.
When you read the newspapers, you hear about the repeated threats from Israeli leaders about the axis of resistance or the ring of fire and Iran's intent to destroy Israel. You argue that Iran doesn't have a grand plan for Israel's destruction. What concrete evidence
Mhm.
supports your claim, and how do you respond to critics who cite Iran's rhetoric as proof of hostile intent?
Well, I would respond by saying that all of these critics cite is Iran's rhetoric, and when they cite it, they usually cite it incorrect. If you want proof, I would submit that my critics should be the ones providing the proof because Iran's policies on the ground don't reflect a long-term diabolical master plan for the destruction of Israel. They reflect a lot of other things. They reflect a desire for influence. They reflect a proactive approach towards Iranian national defense. They reflect an understanding of the Middle East that is based on the notion that Iran must engage rather than isolate itself, which is what Israel does. But they do not reflect intents for destruction, not when it comes to capabilities and not when it comes to, say, operational plans, intelligence from meetings of senior Iranian leaders. The rhetoric that Iran utilizes, and I have had this conversation with many of my critics, is usually phrased in terms of a response. We will destroy Israel if Israel continues to attack us, if Israel assassinates our citizens, if Israel damages or compromises Iranian national security in any way. True, there is anti-Semitism at the highest levels of the Islamic Republic. The Supreme Leader himself, I would assume, is not a great fan of Israel and is a Holocaust denier. But in terms of active policy, in terms of precedence on the ground, there's very little proof that Iran is trying to destroy Israel. In fact, you would have to assume that Iran's presence in multiple arenas of interest around the Middle East is all tightly orchestrated and constantly building towards the day when forces inserted into various areas and regions and who deal with those specific realities on a daily basis, they will then come together, um, sort of like those Japanese anime robots that are comprised, like the Power Rangers, who come together in order to make up one huge fighting robot. That will happen, and then Iran will go to war with Israel. Respectfully, that seems way, way far-fetched. The reality on the ground, which is much more fragmented, much more elaborate, and much more limited in nature and scope, seems to me to fit, the contours of human endeavor much more effectively than this grand master plan that is based on this grand master goal, utter destruction.
So Israel, it would be fair to say that Israel acts more aggressively toward Iran than vice versa. Can you provide specific examples of Israeli actions that undermine its narrative of self-defense? And how do these actions potentially escalate conflict in the region?
Well, as far as Israelis are concerned, nothing undermines our narrative of self-defense, and that is, of course, because Um, you know, we mean more, to use the famous Liverpool
Mm.
Football Club slogan.
Yeah.
We mean more. Israel is devoted to, and I'm a Liverpool fan. Israel, at the heart of Israel lies the notion of security. And the most immediate, all-pervading meaning of security is to keep Jews alive. Okay? That is really Israel's most basic purpose. And basic meaning apolitical, and really hardwired into every aspect of the Israeli state. And that means that anybody who threatens Jewish lives is a threat and should be dealt with. And Israel doesn't mean to kill civilians or bystanders or non-combatants, but Israel is going after potential threat. And if you stand in Israel's way, then you are fair game. So nothing shakes our narrative of self-defense. But we've done various things in Iran. We have attacked Iranian weapons factories on Iranian soil. We have kidnapped Iranian citizens on Iranian soil. We have assassinated Iranian citizens on Iranian soil. We have built on Iran's border with Azerbaijan. We have built various Israeli intelligence compounds that are used for gathering intelligence from inside Iran. We've done a great many things that are very aggressive, much more so than Iran, if only because our abilities are greater, because we can do them. But we've done all these things that Iran has not done. Is it a competition? Sometimes it isn't, but at times it is. Look at the documented dimensions of Israeli aggression. And in just about all three main cases, all three main fronts on which Israel is fighting at the moment, that is Gaza and Lebanon and Iran, Israel has attacked much more frequently and more intensely than its rivals have.
If it is a game, I suppose the biggest retaliation that we've seen from Iran so far, for all of the things that you've said, was last April's missile and drone strike against Israel. Can you give our audience an idea of why it failed so dismally? Was it really just a case of superior Israeli technology, or was it not really intended to do anything other than, I don't know, frighten the IDF general staff? Not, I don't think that that's even possible, but nonetheless, what do you think was behind all of that?
I think it was mostly intended for show. I think
Right.
Israel does have tremendous technology, but not only was it intended for show, it was also coordinated. So a lot of the countries through which these rockets and missiles and drones flew were able to intercept them. I know this from, well, other countries' participation notwithstanding, interviews with Israeli Air Force pilots were very revealing when asked if they felt um, threatened or under pressure. At least two Israeli pilots who were interviewed anonymously said, no, it was like being at a firing range. Okay, so yes, there was an attack. It was meant to inflict very minor damage. I don't think the Iranians used the best of their potential attack vehicles. And even if they did, I don't think the Iranian missile program is an existential threat to Israel. But more than anything, this was a production. This was a gesture that was meant to be appreciated for the future rather than cause immediate attack or instigate war. And I think the most effective proof of that is not related to the quality of missiles the Iranians used. It is related to the world's response.
Mm.
Had Iran done anything like this, say, even a year before, I think Iran would have faced a potential war. And this attack was, whether the world will admit it or not, accepted as legitimate. I'll remind your listeners that the attack occurred after Israel bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus. So this attack was seen as legitimate, which was a major blow to Israel's stature, but of course it went unreported
Mm.
because nobody talks about these things.
Yeah, that's true. So, if we get back to the issue of Hezbollah, we've just seen over the last few hours, and an intensification of strikes. And it seems like both Israel and Hezbollah are locked in a cycle of never-ending provocation. You've criticized Israel for not seeking a peace agreement with Lebanon. What would an agreement between Israel and Lebanon look like in today's geopolitical climate? And how might Hezbollah's role evolve in such a scenario?
I don't think Israel should seek a peace agreement with Lebanon, but I think Israel's insistence on a constant attacks and, of course, presenting itself as the victim is extremely counterproductive for Israeli national security interests. What I believe can happen is a return to UN Security Council Resolution 1701 that ended the war between Israel and Lebanon in 2006. That resolution called for a negotiated settlement that would define the location of the various entities on the Israeli-Lebanese border. These negotiations never happened. Neither Israel nor Hezbollah or the government of Lebanon were interested in initiating them, so they never happened. In Israel, it's very common now to say that Hezbollah is violating Resolution 1701. It isn't. And there's certainly room there for an international mechanism that would resemble negotiations between Israel and Lebanon's government over natural gas deposits in the Mediterranean. I'm not talking about peace. I'm talking about a cessation of hostilities and a negotiation that is meant to establish some space that has good faith and potential trust. There's no need to seek peace. What we need is a cessation of hostilities and a period of time long enough for good faith to be generated and gradually evolve. What role can Hezbollah play in this? A very important role. Hezbollah is the biggest political power in Lebanon. Hezbollah demonstrated that it is willing to accept pragmatic solutions when it came to the oil and gas. I wouldn't advocate for peace right now because peace seems both very, very radical and also I'm not even sure what peace means
Yeah.
after a year of a war in Gaza and these attacks in Lebanon. I would hope for the ability to negotiate and accept the other side's presence. I think Israel can do that, and I think Hezbollah can do that. I think they've proven they can do that. It just remains to persuade both sides that it is in their mutual interest to expedite a solution of this nature.
Iran's pursuit of nuclear capabilities is often viewed as a threat to Middle Eastern stability. In your view, how does Iran's nuclear program serve its broader strategic goals? And what risks does it pose for Israel, particularly in light of its own nuclear arsenal?
I think Iran's nuclear program serves mostly Iranian purposes. I think Iran wants to be acknowledged as a regional power. I think it wants the sizable deterrent that it has learned gets you treated seriously by the international community. And keep in mind, again, that Iran is very much interested in rejoining the world, as it were, and being accepted as the power it sees itself as being. And I think they believe a nuclear deterrent can do that. Of course, the nuclear program has also acquired a kind of an independent status following all of these years of negotiations and wars and attacks and Israel's adamant position against it and so on. So for the Iranians now, the nuclear issue is of importance regardless of a larger national security concept or anything of the sort. It's important because it's a place where Iran hurts if you poke it because it's been a battleground for the tested Iran's mettle and resolve, and Iran does not want to be found lacking or wanting. What will an Iranian nuclear program do for the Middle East, do for Israel? Look, generally, I think that Iran's decision to become nuclear is a political decision. It's not based on whether Iran builds a certain number of plants or reactors or centrifuges or whatever. It's a political decision. And Iran, I think, has the capability to decide that it wants to go nuclear. The fact that it hasn't says a lot about the generally pragmatic way Iran approaches its national security challenges. Iran, in a way, has more to gain from being on the verge of a nuclear program than it does from actually possessing nuclear weapons. And for Israel, Israel is very energetic in explaining that if Iran manages to get a nuclear weapon, the entire region will go into a crazy arms race. I don't know if that's true. Arabia is already there, lobbying the Americans and funding the Pakistani program and so on. I think Israel, being the nuclear power that it is, with several hundred nuclear devices ready for delivery in a broad variety of platforms, is very much afraid that its regional supremacy in that sense will be shattered. You have to add to that, again, the narrative that we discussed previously about destruction, about Iran being fanatical and extreme and insane. You know, we used to talk about how even though we understand Iran is pragmatic, we can't take the risk that some crazy messianic zealot will gain control of the red button. Uh, you can sort of say that about Israel now. So while it's quite frightening, there is an emerging symmetry, if you will. And of course, that frightens Israel, but that is also in a very significant way of Israel's doing.
You know, when the Trump administration brokered the Abraham Accords, many, myself included, thought that perhaps, just perhaps, this might signal a general warming of ties between some significant part of the Arab world and Israel, behind which may emerge a fair and just settlement of Palestine. God, how naive were we to think that?
Yeah, the Abraham Accords turned out to be exactly what I think they were. They were a very specifically tailor-made deal meant to bring the United Arab Emirates certain things they wanted from the United States and potentially from Israel. And for Israel, I think the real purpose of the Abraham Accords was this was the most concentrated attempt to make the Palestinian issue disappear, take the Palestinian issue off the table. Ultimately, the Accords were meant to launder Israel's occupation, and had Saudi Arabia come along and normalization pursued, Israel could have made a legitimate case that nobody cares about the Palestinians. But because the Accords were so limited in nature, and remember, we're talking about Morocco, a country with which Israel has had semi-discrete relationship for pretty much ever, and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, which is a non-entity. Sudan, even Sudan has not signed, certainly not other countries. So this was not meant. This was not really meant, or was not really designed. And in fact, there was very little design. The accords themselves are a very thin agreement. This was not designed to create any kind of broad regional effect. This was designed to satisfy the very specific needs of Emirati leadership and to allow Netanyahu to make the claim that now that Israel is a Middle Eastern presence and about to lead a confederation of the moderates against the Iranian extremists, then this is a tremendous coup. It has radically altered Israel's status in the Middle East. But I mean, look at it now. There's nothing moderate about Israel. There's no confederacy of moderates. If anything, Israel is making Iran look much better than it has ever looked. And the Abraham Accords are, they've got their specific purpose, and I suppose that they help Israeli interests in various ways, but they have not turned the tide.
Okay, so Ori, I've got to ask you this question. Whatever happened to diplomacy? Do Israelis now take it for granted that the military solution is the only solution toward a peaceful neighborhood?
Yes, and now it's not even the only solution towards a peaceful neighborhood. It's just the only way to go. There's no other way to go. Because October 7th was a great shock for Israelis, but it was also, once the initial shock wore off, it was also a validation of something that the great majority of us that we had always known, which was leave Palestinians and potentially Arabs to their own devices, and you'll end up with a group of people who wants to kill Jews. And because that's the case, yes, I mean, that's where Israeli discourse is, by the way. When Israelis are talking about potential military conscription of the ultra-Orthodox, about a
Mm.
million strong, don't serve in the Israeli military. The reason that it keeps coming up is we're going to need all of these troops. The military is going to have to grow exponentially to deal with all of these threats. This is an interesting point. Israelis don't think war is the solution or that war will bring peace. Israelis think that war is life as it is, that it is existence, that existence requires war. We've regressed mightily, and part of that had to do with the effects of the Hamas attack on October 7th, because it took us back to this truth that Israel was in many ways founded upon, and that is that you can't trust and you can't believe the Arabs because ultimately they want to kill Jews, certainly not the Palestinians. So when we're talking about domestic issues, the one thing that seems to be very clear to everybody here is that our defense budget is going to grow enormously, and that our military needs more soldiers and more weapons. And nobody's saying anything like, hey, maybe before we implode completely, now is the time to consider diplomatic solutions. No, it's a generally held conventional wisdom that there is really no option but war. We're going to have to fight it out.
Just listening to what you're saying, it kind of reminds me of the war on terrorism where, the Americans were running around the world playing whack-a-mole, basically. And now the
Yep,
Israelis are doing exactly the same. And the
exactly.
call up of the ultra-Orthodox, I don't think is going to go very well for Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition because they've been benefiting from other Jews wearing the uniform and making the ultimate sacrifice for them to survive. So that has to have some sort of weird political implication for Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition, shouldn't it?
Well, your whack-a-mole metaphor is remarkably apt. I would maybe even see you and raise you, and we're running around like a headless chicken. We're not even whacking moles.
Mm,
There's no rhyme or reason. There's nothing but the immediately tactical. I mean, take something like this pager attack that Israel
mm,
orchestrated in Lebanon. Everybody's talking. Everybody in Israel is talking about how brilliant it was because it designated Hezbollah personnel, and I'm not even talking about the atrocities and the general sense of smug humor here in Israel at the videos of Lebanese exploding. I'm talking about the tactical necessities that create an operation like this. I mean, Israel had obviously been planning and executing this for years. Once you insert explosives into these devices, this has an expiration date. You can't leave them there forever and then explode them when you see it strategically convenient. So this
mm,
operation probably also took place because it had to take place. But that's Israel for you now. We'll do that, and we'll deal with the repercussions later if they come. Everybody hates us anyway. Nobody's rooting for us. We don't have any support. So screw it. We'll kill as many enemies as we can, and we'll
mm.
handle the compunctions later. Yeah, that's Israel, and your analogy to the war on terror is also, I think, very much on hitting the nail on the head. Because just like the war on terror, we are very pleased to deal, on the one hand, with this broad, all-encompassing enmity. Wherever you go, everybody wants to kill us. But part of our strategy is to break it down and instrumentalize it into endless different tasks that must be pursued. Think about Israel's justification for its actions in Gaza. Supposedly, Israel is targeting Hamas operatives. But as it targets an endless list of Hamas operatives generated by an AI algorithm, it also bombs schools. It also kills tens of thousands of innocent civilians. But we don't care because we've got our goal defined. We have to kill these bad guys. And if anybody gets between us and them, it's their problem. So, yeah, it'll probably end exactly like the war on terror ended, ever so successfully.
Yep, yep. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast from Tel Aviv, Israel. We're speaking with Dr. Ori Goldberg, an Israeli commentator and expert on Israel-Iran relations. Ori, after 11 months of Netanyahu's war against Hamas, is the Israeli Prime Minister in a stronger position than where he was on October 6, 2023?
Oh, good question. It's complicated. Yes and no.
No.
No, because the country is going to the dogs. That's very obvious. The economy is collapsing. All the welfare network is collapsing. The educational system isn't operating. Things are very, very bad here now. Very bad, and the general resilience is quite low. And the sense that the sense of foreboding, this conviction that this will not end well, is very powerful and very pervasive. On the other hand, most Israelis, as I said, cannot see an alternative but war. And Netanyahu is selling war. Netanyahu is saying, yes, that's what we have to do. We have no other choice. So a lot of Israelis don't trust Netanyahu and don't like Netanyahu, but a lot of Israelis support Netanyahu's policies. And potential competitors for Netanyahu, Israeli political leaders from the opposition, they pretty much say what Netanyahu is saying. None of them is coming out against the war. None of them is coming out against war. None of them is presenting Israelis with any sort of political alternative to the current perennial war. And I think a lot of Israelis, should elections come along, will ask themselves if they want to vote for the pale, lackluster epigons, or do they want to vote for the original? And in that sense, I think, and Netanyahu knows it, I think he's presenting himself as the original. And I understand that his polling numbers are rising. And I think he stands a good chance of winning an election if one is held within the year. That
Wow.
is, unless he's convicted. Unless he's convicted in court. Yeah, it's, again, not because anybody likes him. Nobody likes him. And everybody thinks he's corrupt and a little mad. But there are no real alternatives. Nobody stands out. Nobody differentiates themselves from Netanyahu. And this is something that has already happened in elections past. A lot of Israelis don't like him, but when they come to think of it, he says what they agree with, and he says what everybody else says anyway. So why not?
It appears, and I know that I'm saying this with tongue firmly in cheek, Ori, but it appears that Netanyahu is one of the luckiest politicians, apart from Donald Trump, that we've seen in recent times. You know, logic says that people like this should not survive, and yet they are thriving in this environment of chaos. So I suppose the only other question that I have for you on this matter of diplomacy is, if the Israelis can't or won't, because of various constraints, conceive of a peace, does that then leave the international community with opportunity to try to step into the breach and broker some sort of solution? Or, because of the way that Netanyahu and his right-wing colleagues have put themselves into the mindset of the Israeli people, is it a case of the international community is now turned against Netanyahu and Israel to such a degree that everyone thinks, screw it, we're just going to go ahead and do whatever the hell we like until we get our end point, whatever that end point happens to be, because no one knows, as you rightly say.
Well, I think the second option you described, I think, is more accurate when it comes to Israel. Yes, there's a sense of, as the French say, après moi le déluge.
Hmm.
The floodwaters are about to come and wash everything and everybody away. So let's all do what we want. That includes things like political appointments in for to state jobs throughout the public sector. They're also doing that. Um, I think there will be no solution if the international community does not step in. The international community has to step in and take executive authority for pretty much everything from Israel's hands. I think the time is right for sanctions, for embargoes, for an enforcement of the ICJ advisory opinion declaring the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories illegal from head to toe. I think all of this is very much necessary and required. Will the international community do that? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to understand what the Americans are doing with regard to Israel's actions in Lebanon. I just heard this morning that an unnamed senior American source said that Hezbollah had been the losses Hezbollah had suffered, especially when it came to weapons over the last few days, have taken it back 20 years. It seems to me like the United States is trying to mollify Israel and is maybe steering Israel towards a mission accomplished moment, like George W. Bush's infamous speech on that aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
And because maybe, Israel is in such a state, it is in just such an uncontrollable tantrum. And maybe the only way is to sort of provide Israel with a chance to say, look, we've won. There have been rumors circulating in Israel over the last few days that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, has died.
Mm.
Now, if America can do the somersault and stick the landing, if Israel can be allowed to go out and say, Sinwar has died, and we've taken Hezbollah 20 years back, so we won. Maybe that's the only way to get Israel to stop. I don't know.
Mm.
I get a sense that things are changing in the United States, but I don't think they're changing rapidly enough with the election coming on and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And unless the international community steps in, I don't see anybody in Israel who has the will or the capability of altering the suicidal path on which we seem to be traveling.
Ori, I've got to ask you, how consequential was Biden's pushback of Netanyahu on the sale of a whole gamut of little things? Nothing that was going to upset the apple cart too much, but at least a little bit was kind of withheld slightly by the Biden administration. Was this something significant, or was it something that the Israelis were quite happy to, or the Israeli government was quite happy to just, let them do whatever they do. We've got enough stuff to keep us going for a while. I mean, how was that? Um, I suppose you could say minor breach in Israeli-American relations perceived.
I think it was a minor breach. I don't think it was particularly significant.
Mm.
I think it seemed significant at the time, but I can say that this about myself. I'm also, a product of this global order and this rationalization of the way of the world. And I also find myself latching on, holding on very powerfully to every American gesture that seemed in any way to limit Israel or curtail Israel's abilities. I don't accept the broad conspiracy leaning theories that suggest that Israel and the United States have been planning a regional war for some time and are only, gradually allowing it to unfold. I don't buy into that.
Mm.
I don't think America wants a regional war, but I am forced to accept critiques leveled at the United States for allowing Israel to do what it does and act the way it acts. I think that's true. I think it is almost impossible to to ignore how deeply American support has enabled Israel's sense of impunity and entitlement. I
Yeah.
thought it was really significant, Biden's pushback, but turns out not so much.
This is such a depressing topic to cover. But anyway, look, let's press
Yes, it
on.
is.
Let's press on. We in the West often hear that Israelis and Jews more generally are divided between secularists and radical religious and nationalist groups. Recently, we spoke with British demographer Dr. Paul Morland, who cited Israel as a shining example of population growth at a time of population decline everywhere else. However, the larger Israeli population seem to be coming from the settler population, which more often than not has more radicalized religious and/or Jewish nationalist sentiments. How does this dynamic play out in Israeli politics today?
Good question. Look, the settlers are powerful and have a powerful base and are an extremely mobilized society and always there for demonstrations and so on and so forth. But they are a sector. They don't hold the nation. They don't have the national spirit. Not That's not to suggest the national spirit is liberal or left-leaning or pro-peaceful coexistence by any means, but the nation is still secular to some extent. Don't forget, Western standards of secularity are not Israeli standards of secularity. So the nation is still secular in many ways, and the settlers and, in a way, the ultra-Orthodox, although they're not allied, they're just both very right-wing, each in their own way. The settlers differ from the ultra-Orthodox in that it is very important for them to feel like they shape Israeli public space. So they're trying to do all sorts of things to establish a presence, a controlling presence in Israeli public space. Like, for example, this is upcoming. Next week, Israel will begin celebrating its high holidays, the beginning of the Jewish New Year and Yom Kippur, and the week-long holiday of Sukkot. And there's a battle brewing between, in Tel Aviv, the heartland, the stronghold of Israeli secularity, between Tel Aviv residents and settlers who want to come in and hold religious prayers in the middle of the city in an outdoor square. And not only that, but they want a separation between men and women. And Tel Aviv residents are very, very much up in arms about that. And there's talk of, major scuffle on Yom Kippur, which is the holiest Jewish day. So yes, there's a lot of that in the air. And a lot of Israelis are talking about potential civil war that has to occur because secular Jews call the settlers the Messianics, okay? Insinuating that they're crazy, that they don't believe in. And yes, that's in the air in a major way, but there's also this profound underlying consensus because both the secularists and the Messianics support the war. Both support what Israel is doing in Gaza, both support what Israel is doing in Lebanon. And ultimately, will there be a civil war? I highly doubt it because the underlying consensus is stronger than the cultural rifts. Maybe there'll be scuffles, maybe there'll be a struggle, but if I've learned anything about my country over the past year is that the national unity that is rooted in the necessity of Jewish supremacy for Israel's existence is stronger than pretty much everything else.
Ori, getting to the very heart of Israeli identity, is Israel a Middle Eastern state or a state that happens to be in the Middle East?
Oh, wow. Uh, Certainly one of the $64,000 questions. We, of course, like to think of ourselves as a state that happens to be in the Middle East, but more and more we appear to be a Middle Eastern country through and through. Our understanding of democracy, our commitment to resolving conflicts through the use of force, our treatment of minorities, the gradual weakening of the state as the supreme civil institution, the building of parallel power bases and militias, and yeah, I think effectively speaking, we're a Middle Eastern country.
Of course, all these things that you mentioned flies in the face that Israel is a vibrant democracy. What are your thoughts on that?
Is Israel a vibrant democracy? I Look, I don't think you can pretend to be a vibrant democracy if your greatest act of state in terms of resources and manpower is the perpetuation of a nearly 60-year-old military dictatorship, which is what military occupation of the Palestinian territories is. You can't, and you can't have a democracy maintain a dictatorship. And the reason you can't is that life under a dictatorship is much easier and much more efficient, and democracy is messy and fragile. And if a democracy has to contend with a dictatorship, and remember, the same people are running both,
Yep.
then those running the dictatorship will ultimately win because dictatorships are easier for the powers that be. And So Israel certainly was an attempt at democracy. It's certainly a democracy for Jews. It's not a democracy for Palestinians, both occupied and citizens. And it is not a democracy because a democracy cannot be committed heart and soul to the maintenance of a military dictatorship.
Ori, we have to return to something which has bothered me for a while now. So, the exploding pager and walkie-talkie events that recently targeted Hezbollah operatives will no doubt go down in history as one of the Israeli intelligence service's most daring operations, which you have alluded to earlier. This, of course, stands in stark contrast to the evident and catastrophic intelligence failure that led to Hamas's October 7 attack. What can you say about the significant gap between these two events? One that showed complete Israeli intelligence superiority, while the other showed complete and utter failure.
I can say that I think they're intimately related. And I'll try and portray them through a perspective that's different from the one you've just presented. The pager attack, it may be, brilliant in terms of operational planning and I guess execution, but it's also a horror. It's also a terrorist attack because it was 3,000 separate detonations with absolutely no precautions taken for regarding the safety of civilians. It was meant to pressure and cause fear to a civilian population as well. It was not even a targeted assassination like the ones carried out in Lebanon over the last few days. And such an attack, uh, the ability to see and to celebrate the operational, tactical success and not take into any kind of consideration the horrific consequences, immediate consequences, is intimately related to the vanity which lies at the heart of the intelligence failure on October 7th. The intelligence failure on October 7th is not a result of a malfunction or of the system not working or of even some kind of more systemic failure. It's the result of a state of mind. And the state of mind is, or was, that Hamas can't do that, right? I mean, leave aside the atrocities for a second, okay? The atrocities we actually expected. The one part that Israel hardly ever talks about is that Hamas raided 3 highly secure military installations and took them over very easily, okay, with means that are aeons behind what Israel has. With all Israel's technology, Hamas was able to do that. That cannot be the result of a specific mistake. It's a result of a mindset that assumes Hamas to be slacking, that assumes Hamas to be incapable of mounting such operations because that's what they are. That's what we made them. They talk the talk, but ultimately they're Palestinians and they're Arabs, and we are their lords and masters, and we've got them where we want. And this indifference, right, the sense of superiority that allows for radical indifference to human life when perpetrating an attack like the pager attack on the one hand, and also ignoring very immediate evidence to the contrary on the other. There's an intimate relationship there. It comes from the same place. It comes from a deep-seated sense of superiority. We know what's what. We know the facts. We've got the technology. We've got the know-how. And they are lesser than us. They are not
That
as
breed,
capable as us.
that seems to me, in my thinking, to breed a great deal of institutional complacency. You just
Mhm.
after a while you just believe your own bullshit effectively, and
Yeah,
you do so with such arrogance and disregard that when the surprise happens, it catches everyone completely off guard like it did on October 7. So yeah, there is a
that's right.
systemic problem to all of this, eh?
There's a systemic problem, but it far exceeds the scope of military intelligence or Mossad. The systemic problem has to do with Israel's perception of itself And yes, I agree completely. You end up in a solipsistic circle. There's nobody real but you. These other people, it's not that just they're, it's not that they're just inferior to you. They're not really there. They're
Yeah.
phantasms, they're ghosts. And the one thing I think the most grievous crime Hamas committed against Israel on October 7th is that we can't unsee them. They have imprinted themselves on our retinas. We cannot assume that they're not really there anymore. They are there. They're not going anywhere. Remember what we talked about when we talked about the Abraham Accords? We wanted to make them go away. The rationale of the occupation is exactly that. It's not to kill all the Palestinians. It's to make them go away, to make them have them stay out of our sight, know their place and stay out of our sight. And October 7th
Yeah.
took us by such surprise because that is no longer possible.
I hate to use the A word, but I will just for the sake of, well, being daring, I suppose. That sounds awfully like apartheid, if you ask me.
Of course it does. It is very much based on apartheid, and the mindset that was bred by decades of apartheid is exactly the mindset that Israel has today. Yes, they are not human. And again, it's very easy to think of Israel's actions as the result of a detailed plan to get rid of all the Palestinians, to kill them all. I think it's much more horrible than that. It's such utter dehumanization that in many ways, not in many ways, it's such utter dehumanization that we've gone and dehumanized ourselves. We've lost the capacity to look at them as human beings, and we've lost the ability to act like human beings. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Ori, very little has been said or reported about the Palestinian authorities in these past 11 months of the Netanyahu-Hamas war in Gaza. Its leader, Mahmoud Abbas, is 89 years old. He's never appeared to be a particularly effective or charismatic leader. Are the Palestinian authorities' days numbered in holding sway over the West Bank? And what do we really know about the lives of Palestinians living there?
The lives of Palestinians living there are horrible because most of them are not allowed to go work in Israel as they once did, so they don't get paid. A lot of them, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, are living in abject poverty because there's nothing for them to do. And which is, of course, one of the reasons why armed struggle is rearing its head in the Palestinian territories. As far as the fate of the Palestinian Authority, it's been consigned to oblivion many times before. I don't know what the political reality would be like when this war in Gaza stops. I would imagine the Palestinian Authority will not be expiring anytime soon, if only for need of its symbolic auspices to sponsor some kind of Palestinian reconciliation, to allow Hamas to rename itself and join the national institutions. Palestinian Authority is still all that. I doubt Abbas will remain in power. He's a corrupt leader, greatly unloved by his people. I don't know who will replace him. Israelis like to play that game now. Who would we want to conduct negotiations about Gaza? It's not for us to say. And I hope we will lose the authority to say it soon.
Mm.
Palestinians have to decide. It will take time, but I don't see the Palestinian Authority going away, despite the fact that it is an abject failure pretty much in every way.
Ori, just quickly about the international community again and how it relates to Israel under current circumstances. Of course, you did mention that, we're heading into the high electoral cycle of the United States at the moment. We have the Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris putting her hat in the ring, and we have Donald J. Trump. Now, who do you think would best serve Israel's interests in terms of making things happen in a positive way? I mean, it seems that it's very difficult for any American president to pull apart their relationship with Israel. I mean, of all the countries of the world that America is allied to, Israel, right or wrong, America will stand by right to the very end. But I suppose some presidents play that game more than others. Who do you think plays that game more than the other in this contest leading up to November 5th?
Um, just off the cuff, Trump is not a positive person. So expecting Trump to be an agent of positive change, um, I don't really see that coming. Trump will try to close deals, but this is not time for deals. This is time for a Marshall Plan. Is Harris capable of doing that? Yeah, I think certainly much more capable than Donald Trump. I would hope that she is because I think there are a lot of political points to be won there with a growing constituency of younger people who are certainly minded towards what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East and are certainly wary of Israel and want America to stay away from it. I will say that even if Trump is elected, Trump wants war even less than Harris does. If Trump has ever promised his base anything, is that he would not involve America in faraway, redundant wars. So I don't think any president will support an Israeli effort to prolong the war. I think Harris will undoubtedly prove more effective in advocating for change. I don't know what her commitment level is. I don't know how effective she is, but certainly Harris much more so than Trump.
Ori, is it possible for the Americans to get themselves trapped by Netanyahu in any of their whack-a-mole campaigns around Israel's periphery?
I would highly, highly, highly doubt that.
Hmm.
I would assume that that is uh, not the case. I think the Americans really don't want any of that in any way. We'll have to wait and see, but I doubt that.
Okay.
I think it'll probably be something else.
Ori, final question. It seems that since its founding in 1948, Israel has been caught up in continuous wars, some larger in scale and more intense, involving many hostile Arab states, others lower in scale, involving Iran and tentatively aligned state and non-state actors in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. In game theory, and I'm specifically talking about the prisoner's dilemma, a cycle of non-cooperation can be broken by either one side or the other, where one participant is unilaterally willing to show trust in the other. How likely are we to see either Israel or Iran show a more cooperative and collaborative side to break with past patterns of mistrust and violence?
Not very likely, but certainly Iran seems to be realizing the advantages um, of being Israel's negative, of not doing what Israel is doing. The more positively incentivized Iran is in that regard, the more likely we are to, again, not show a display of trust, but just restraint and refraining from any kind of armed involvement. Of course, Israel will interpret this as Iran demonstrating its weakness and succumbing to pressure and all that. But I think Iranians know the truth. And the world knows the truth. And the truth is that Israel is presenting Iran with a way out of the trap that Iran had dug itself. What are the implications of this for the long term? I'm not sure, but I would say that's the direction where this is going.
Ori Goldberg, thanks for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
That was Israeli commentator and Israel-Iran expert, Dr. Ori Goldberg. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Ori Goldberg. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Ori and connect with him on social media. How has Israeli media shaped your understanding of Iran's intentions? And did Dr. Goldberg's insights challenge or reaffirm your perspective? Do you think Israel's current approach to Hezbollah and Iran is primarily defensive or aggressive? And how might a more nuanced understanding of these adversaries change Israel's strategy? Dr. Goldberg mentioned the complexities behind Iran's nuclear ambitions. How do you feel this impacts the balance of power in the Middle East, particularly with Israel's own nuclear capabilities? After hearing Dr. Goldberg's views on Gaza, Hezbollah, and Iran, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions driving conflict in the region today? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them into the comments section on YouTube and I'll do my best to answer as many of them as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at @thefocus_sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.